At my wife's company's party, my wife mocked me. Her female boss slipped me a card and whispered, "Call me if you want a woman who values you." My wife's face when she saw her hand on my shoulder, unforgettable. I should have known the night was doomed the moment Chloe started having a full-blown conversation with her reflection in our bedroom mirror. And honestly, the mirror was getting more attention than I'd gotten all week. She was standing there in her sleek black cocktail dress that probably cost more than my first car, adjusting her diamond earrings with the precision of a surgeon performing open-heart surgery, while I sat on the edge of our bed wondering if I should just start introducing myself to people as Chloe's +1 to save everyone the awkward confusion. Tonight was her night, and she'd made that abundantly clear about 17 times since breakfast. She was a senior researcher at Innovate Pharma, some fancy pharmaceutical company that threw an annual gala every year where everyone pretended to care about scientific breakthroughs while actually just networking and getting hammered on free champagne. The whole event was basically LinkedIn come to life, except with better lighting and worse conversations. And me? Well, I was cast in the critically acclaimed role of supportive husband, which is corporate speak for a human coat rack who occasionally nods and smiles on command. "Try to blend in tonight, Daniel," Chloe said, without even turning away from her mirror, like she was giving instructions to a poorly trained puppy. Her tone had that special quality that made it sound less like a suggestion and more like a threat wrapped in expensive perfume. "Sure thing," I replied, straightening my tie that suddenly felt like a noose. "Should I also work on my invisibility skills, or is that something that'll just happen naturally once we walk through those doors?" I was aiming for humor, maybe a little laugh to cut through the tension that had been building in our house like smog over Los Angeles. She didn't laugh. Of course she didn't laugh. Chloe had stopped finding me funny approximately around the same time she got promoted to her current position, which coincidentally was also when she started referring to Casual Friday as inappropriate workplace culture. Humor apparently didn't fit into her carefully curated executive aura, which was something she'd actually said out loud to me last month without a trace of irony. I'd laugh then too. She hadn't. The ballroom at the Grand Meridian Hotel looked exactly like what would happen if a luxury perfume commercial had a baby with a corporate training video. And that baby grew up to have really expensive taste and no personality. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen fireworks, casting this weird golden glow over everything that made everyone look either ethereally beautiful or slightly jaundiced, depending on your blood alcohol level. Round tables covered in white linens dotted the space like islands in a sea of polished marble floors. And everywhere you looked, there were people in designer suits and dresses pretending that small talk was an Olympic sport they were all competing in. The second we crossed the threshold into that ballroom, I watched my wife transform right before my eyes, like Clark Kent ducking into a phone booth. Except instead of becoming Superman, she became corporate Barbie with a master's degree and an attitude problem. It was honestly impressive how fast she could flip that switch. One second she was Chloe, my wife of 7 years, who still had that little snort when she laughed really hard. The next second, she was Dr. Chloe Miller, senior research scientist, complete with the power handshake, the manufactured laughter that sounded like it came from a can, and the ability to say, "Oh my gosh, your presentation on protein inhibitors was absolutely life-changing," without visibly gagging. I followed behind her like a lost puppy as she worked the room, watching her float from group to group with the grace of someone who'd been practicing this dance for years. She'd lean in conspiratorially with Dr. Evans from oncology research, throw her head back in exaggerated amusement at something Dr. Garcia said about enzyme reactions, and air kiss people she'd spent the last 3 months complaining about during our sad dinner for 2 nights at home. It was a masterclass in professional fakery, and I had front row seats to the show. When she finally got around to introducing me to people, which happened with about as much enthusiasm as someone showing off a moderately interesting houseplant, it went something like this. "Oh, and this is my husband Daniel. He does something with logistics."
She'd wave her hand vaguely in my direction, like she was gesturing toward a piece of furniture she couldn't quite remember buying, and then immediately pivot back to whoever she was trying to impress, leaving me standing there like a game show contestant who'd just lost in the first round. Something with logistics. That's how she described my career. Never mind that I owned and operated a successful logistics optimization firm that specialized in pharmaceutical supply chain management. Never mind that I'd spent the last 8 years building a business from scratch that now employed 15 people and had contracts with 3 major companies. Never mind that I probably understood the technical side of getting their precious drugs from point A to point B better than half the people in this room. Nope, I was just Daniel, the guy who does something with logistics. Like I was some kind of mystery animal at a petting zoo that nobody should feed after midnight or get wet. By the third introduction, the pattern had become painfully clear, and I'd come to the sobering realization that I was basically her handbag, except less fashionable and with more feelings that could get hurt. I was an accessory, a prop, a barely sentient piece of arm candy that she'd brought along because showing up solo to these things apparently sent the wrong message about work-life balance or whatever corporate buzzword was trending this quarter.
Every single time I tried to contribute something meaningful to a conversation, something that might remind these people that I had a functioning brain and relevant expertise, Chloe would swoop in like a conversational sniper and take me out with surgical precision. Dr. Roberts, this intense-looking guy with salt and pepper hair and glasses that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, mentioned that they were having supply chain issues with their new drug rollout. My ears perked up because, hey, this was literally what I did for a living. This was my moment. Funny enough, that's actually my area of expertise, I started, feeling a little spark of hope that maybe I could contribute something valuable to this evening beyond just my presence. I've dealt with similar distribution challenges, and there are some strategies, Daniel, sweetheart. Chloe cut me off with the warmth of a Canadian winter, placing her hand on my arm with just enough pressure to communicate that I should shut up immediately. Could you be a dear and grab me a Chardonnay? I'm absolutely parched. Her smile was plastic fantastic, all teeth and zero sincerity, and her eyes had that special glint that said we'd be having words about this later. Sure, why not? I absolutely loved being publicly demoted from successful business owner to glorified bartender in front of a room full of people who probably already thought I was Chloe's charity case. Nothing says healthy marriage quite like being treated like the help at a party where you are supposed to be a guest. I nodded, smiled my best "yes, dear" smile, and headed toward the bar, feeling the weight of my dignity crumbling like a stale cookie in my pocket. The bartender was this college-aged kid with a man bun and a vest that was trying way too hard to look sophisticated. He caught my eye as I approached, and I swear I saw a flicker of recognition there, like we were both members of the same sad club. He gave me this look that said, "Hang in there, bro. We've all been there." And I appreciated the solidarity, even if it came from someone who was probably serving drinks to pay for his philosophy degree. "Rough night?" he asked, already reaching for a wine glass, because apparently my misery was that obvious. "I'm just doing my internship and humiliation studies," I told him, leaning against the bar. "Pretty sure I'm about to graduate with honors." He chuckled and poured a generous glass of Chardonnay. "On the house. Man, you look like you need it more than she does." I grabbed the wine and made my way back through the crowd, weaving between conversations about clinical trials and FDA approvals and drug efficacy rates. All topics I actually found interesting, but apparently wasn't qualified to discuss in my wife's presence. When I found Chloe again, she was deep in conversation with 3 other researchers, their heads bent together like they were plotting world domination or at least the next quarterly report. I held out the wine glass. She didn't even look up, just reached out with one perfectly manicured hand, took the glass from me like I was a waiter she couldn't be bothered to acknowledge, and kept talking to her colleagues about protein synthesis or enzyme inhibitors or something that probably would have fascinated me if I wasn't busy having an existential crisis about my marriage. I stood there for a moment, hovering awkwardly at the edge of their circle, waiting for an acknowledgement that never came, before finally accepting that I was just part of the scenery and wandering off to find somewhere else to exist. At that point, even the wait staff was starting to feel sorry for me. This young waiter with kind eyes and a tray of canapes actually stopped next to me and whispered, "Sir, would you like me to accidentally spill something on her dress? I'm very good at making things look accidental." His face was completely serious, like he was genuinely offering this service as part of his duties. I actually smiled for the first time all evening. "That's incredibly tempting," I told him honestly, "but no thanks. She already spilled enough on me tonight, and that was purely emotional. So we're probably at our quota for ruined things." He nodded sympathetically and moved on, leaving me standing alone in a ballroom full of people, feeling more invisible than I'd ever felt in my entire life, and wondering at what exact point my marriage had turned into whatever this sad performance was supposed to be. By the time we hit the third round of introductions, I'd fully accepted my new role in life as Chloe's designer handbag. Except handbags probably got more respect, and definitely didn't have to deal with the emotional whiplash of being married to someone who treated them like an embarrassing tattoo she got in college. At least a purse had a clear purpose and didn't have to stand there pretending to be interested in conversations it wasn't allowed to participate in. I was starting to think those luxury brands had the right idea. Just hang there, silently looking expensive, without having to contribute opinions or, God forbid, demonstrate actual knowledge about anything. The pattern had become so predictable, I could have written a manual on it. Step 1. Chloe approaches a group of colleagues. Step 2. She laughs at something that's not funny and compliments someone's research that she probably hasn't even read. Step 3. Someone acknowledges my existence, usually with a polite, "And you are?" Step 4. Chloe introduces me with all the enthusiasm of someone describing a minor medical condition. Step 5. I'm immediately forgotten, or worse, I try to speak and get shut down faster than a sketchy website on a work computer. Dr. Roberts showed up again, this time with his wife, Sarah, who seemed like an actual human being with a personality, which was refreshing in this sea of corporate robots. They were discussing the nightmare of getting temperature-sensitive medications to rural clinics without the whole batch going bad in transit, which was literally the kind of problem I solved for a living. This was my bread and butter, my wheelhouse, my entire professional jam. I knew the answer to this problem. I'd solved this exact issue for 2 different clients in the past 18 months. The challenge is maintaining the cold chain integrity during the last-mile delivery, Dr. Roberts was saying, running his hand through his hair in frustration. We've lost 3 shipments this quarter alone. It's a logistics nightmare. My brain lit up like a Christmas tree. This was it. This was my moment to actually contribute something valuable, to show these people that I wasn't just some random dude who'd wandered in off the street because the hors d'oeuvres looked good. I opened my mouth, ready to explain the innovative IoT temperature monitoring system we'd implemented that solved this exact problem, complete with real-time alerts and automated rerouting protocols. Actually, that's exactly what I specialize in, I started, feeling a genuine rush of enthusiasm for the first time all night. We've developed a system that— Daniel, sweetheart! Chloe's voice cut through my sentence like a knife through butter, except less useful and more annoying. Her hand landed on my arm with the grip of someone who was definitely going to have words with me later in the car. Could you be absolutely wonderful and grab me another Chardonnay? This one's gotten warm. She held out her still half-full glass with a smile that would have fooled everyone except me and possibly Sarah, who I caught giving Chloe a side eye that could have stripped paint. "Sure, absolutely," I said.
Why would I want to discuss my actual area of expertise when I could instead fulfill my true calling as a mobile beverage delivery service? I took the glass, noting that it was actually still pretty cold, and headed back to the bar for the second time in 20 minutes, feeling my soul slowly leak out through my shoes with each step. The bartender with the man bun saw me coming and actually grimaced in sympathy. "Back already, dude? You okay?" "Living the dream," I told him, sliding the glass across the bar. "The dream where you show up to school naked and everyone's laughing at you, except it's real life and everyone's just politely pretending you don't exist." He poured a fresh glass, and this time he added what looked like an extra generous pour. "My girlfriend treats her laptop better than your wife treats you, and she spilled coffee on it last week." "Don't worry," I said, grabbing the wine. "I'm building character, or having a breakdown. Honestly, at this point, it could go either way." I returned with the wine, performing my duties as the world's most educated drinks waiter. And this time, I didn't even bother trying to insert myself into the conversation. I just handed Chloe the glass and stood there like a potted plant. Except potted plants probably added more to the ambiance and didn't have to deal with the crushing realization that their spouse saw them as nothing more than a convenient accessory. She took the wine without even a glance in my direction. Didn't say thank you, didn't acknowledge the favor, just seamlessly continued her conversation about grant funding and research protocols while I stood there wondering if maybe I'd actually died at some point during the evening and this was just some weird purgatory where I had to watch my wife pretend I didn't exist.
Dr. Robert's wife, Sarah, caught my eye and mouthed, "Sorry," when nobody was looking, which somehow made it worse because it meant other people were noticing this train wreck too. The pity from strangers hits different. You know, it's one thing to feel like garbage. It's another thing entirely when other people can see that you're being treated like garbage and feel bad enough to offer silent sympathy across a crowded room. At one point, I excused myself to use the bathroom, which nobody acknowledged because why would they? And as I walked away, I heard Chloe laugh at something someone said. That real, genuine laugh she used to give me back when we first started dating. And I realized I couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that at anything I'd said. Maybe 6 months ago? A year? Had it been longer? Even the catering staff had started giving me pitying looks. The same waiter from earlier came by with his tray and whispered, "Hang in there, man. Open bar ends at 10, and there's excellent cheesecake coming out in 15 minutes. Sometimes you gotta find joy in the small things." "Thanks," I told him sincerely. "You're literally the nicest person who's talked to me all night, and I don't even know your name." "Liam," he said. "And for what it's worth, you seem like a decent dude who deserves better than whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at the whole scene with his tray. "Liam, you're a gentleman and a scholar," I said, "and yes, I will absolutely be getting that cheesecake." He grinned and moved on, leaving me standing there in my $1,000 suit, feeling like $1 million worth of invisible. That's when she arrived, and I'm not being dramatic when I say the entire energy of the room shifted, like someone had just turned up the gravity by about 30%. Dr. Isabella Rossi, Vice President of Operations at Innovate Pharma, walked into that ballroom like she owned not just the company, but possibly the entire concept of confidence itself. She wasn't tall, maybe 5'7" in heels, but she carried herself like she was 10 feet tall and made of titanium. Her burgundy dress was elegant without trying too hard. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that said, "I'm here for business, but I also have a life." And when she moved through the crowd, people naturally parted like she was royalty, and they were all just extras in her movie. I watched Chloe's entire body language change the second Isabella entered her field of vision. My wife literally stood up straighter, smoothed down her dress like she was about to meet the Queen of England, and I swear I saw her take a deep breath like she was preparing for a performance review that would determine the rest of her natural life. It was actually kind of fascinating, in a sad way, watching someone who'd been so confident and controlling all evening suddenly turn into a nervous intern hoping to get noticed by the teacher. Isabella made her rounds,
graciously accepting greetings and congratulations on the company's recent FDA approval for some breakthrough drug I'd heard Chloe mention approximately 8,000 times over dinner for the past 6 months. She had this way of making everyone feel like they were the only person in the room when she talked to them, giving them her full attention for those 30 seconds before moving on, leaving them glowing like they'd just been blessed by some corporate deity. And then she looked at me. Actually looked at me, not through me or past me or at me like I was a curiosity in a museum, but at me like I was an actual person worth acknowledging. She walked directly over to where Chloe and I were standing, and I watched my wife's face go through about 17 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds, settling somewhere between thrilled and terrified. "Chloe, wonderful work on the Phase 3 trials," Isabella said warmly, shaking my wife's hand with genuine appreciation. Then she turned to me with a smile that actually reached her eyes, which was such a foreign concept at this point that I almost didn't know how to process it. "And you must be Daniel. Chloe mentioned you run a logistics optimization firm specializing in pharmaceutical distribution." Wait, hold up, pause, rewind. Chloe mentioned me? Like specifically mentioned what I actually did for a living? With accurate details and everything? That was news to me. And judging by the slightly panicked look that flashed across my wife's face, it might have been news to her too. Either Isabella had done her homework, or there had been some conversation I wasn't aware of where Chloe had actually described my career with something resembling accuracy. "Yes, ma'am," I said, trying not to sound as surprised as I felt. "I work primarily in cold chain logistics and supply chain optimization. Basically, I make sure expensive drugs don't end up playing hide and seek in warehouses or turning into very pricey puddles in the back of trucks." She laughed, and it wasn't that polite cocktail party laugh that people do when they're being diplomatic. It was real, genuine amusement at my stupid joke, and I felt something in my chest unclench that I hadn't even realized was tight. "That's an excellent way to put it," she said. And then she did something that absolutely floored me. She actually wanted to continue the conversation with me about my work, like I was a real person with valuable expertise worth discussing. We started talking about distribution efficiency systems, the nightmare of maintaining temperature integrity across multiple shipping zones, the complications of rural delivery networks, cost reduction strategies that didn't compromise product safety, and all the FDA compliance hoops you had to jump through that made everything 10 times more complicated. Isabella asked smart questions, the kind that told me she actually understood what I was talking about and wasn't just being polite. She leaned in slightly when I explained a particularly complex solution we'd implemented for a client, nodding thoughtfully and occasionally interjecting with observations that showed she was actually processing the information. "We've been struggling with distribution inefficiencies in our Midwest network," she said, her expression turning more serious. "We're losing about 8% of shipments to quality degradation during transit. Your insights are fascinating. Have you worked with predictive routing algorithms?" Meanwhile, Chloe was standing there looking like she'd just watched her car get towed while she was holding a parking ticket, her smile frozen in place, but her eyes darting between Isabella and me like she was watching a tennis match where the ball was made of her worst nightmare. Every time I said something that Isabella responded to positively, I could literally feel my wife's anxiety levels climbing. It was like watching someone's internal thermostat break in real time. Isabella kept asking questions about my work, about case studies, about specific technical challenges, and I found myself actually enjoying this party for the first time all night. Here was someone who not only acknowledged my existence, but seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, who treated me like an expert in my field, rather than some inconvenient plus one who needed to be managed and controlled. We talked about blockchain applications and supply chain transparency, about IoT sensor networks, about the future of autonomous delivery systems in pharmaceutical logistics. "You clearly know your stuff, Daniel," Isabella said after I'd explained a particularly innovative solution we developed for a client's distribution crisis. "I'm impressed. We should definitely continue this conversation in a more professional setting." Chloe looked like she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. Or maybe swallow me. Or possibly just swallow the entire evening so it could be erased from existence. Her face had gone through several shades of pale, settling on a color I'd describe as existential dread with undertones of barely suppressed panic. This was probably the first time all night that anyone had given me more attention than her, and she was handling it about as well as a cat handles a bath.
And me? I was just standing there, enjoying my little comeback tour, sipping my drink, having an actual intelligent conversation with someone who valued my expertise, and feeling like maybe I wasn't completely invisible after all. It was a nice change of pace from being treated like human furniture. After about 3 hours of forced smiles, fake laughter, and watching my wife network like her life depended on it, which honestly it probably did, I needed an escape route before I started screaming into the decorative ice sculptures or doing something equally dramatic and career-ending for both of us. The ballroom had become suffocating, all recycled air and recycled conversations, and I could feel my sanity starting to pack its bags and head for the exit. So I did what any reasonable person would do when faced with an insufferable social situation. I found the nearest door that led anywhere else and took it. The rooftop terrace was like stepping into a different universe, one where the air was actually breathable and you didn't have to pretend to care about quarterly earnings reports. The city stretched out below in a carpet of lights that looked like someone had spilled a jewelry box across the darkness. And the cool night air hit my face like a blessing from whatever deity protected husbands who were slowly losing their minds at corporate events. There were a few heat lamps scattered around, some tasteful outdoor furniture that probably cost more than my first car, and, most importantly, there was silence. Blessed, beautiful silence that wasn't filled with the sound of my wife pretending I didn't exist. I loosened my time, took a deep breath that actually filled my lungs, and seriously contemplated whether I could just stay up here for the rest of the evening. Maybe I could claim I'd gotten lost. Maybe I could fake a medical emergency. Maybe I could just leap from building to building like a depressed Batman until I made it home, changed into sweatpants, and pretended this whole night had been a bad dream brought on by questionable Chinese takeout. "Rough night," a voice said behind me, and I nearly jumped out of my skin because apparently my ninja detection skills were offline due to emotional exhaustion. I turned around to find Isabella standing there with 2 glasses of red wine, looking amused at my startled reaction. She ditched her blazer somewhere along the way, and she looked more relaxed up here, less like a corporate VP and more like an actual human being who also needed a break from the circus downstairs. "Do I look that broken?" I asked, trying to regain some composure and probably failing miserably. "Not broken," she said, walking over and handing me one of the wine glasses, "just unappreciated. There's a difference." She leaned against the railing next to me, looking out at the city lights with an expression that suggested she'd been to enough of these events to recognize a fellow sufferer when she saw one. We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping our wine and watching the city pretend to be peaceful below us. It was nice, actually having someone's company without feeling like I needed to perform or prove something or justify my existence. Just 2 people drinking wine and acknowledging that sometimes corporate events were their own special kind of hell. "I've been to about 100 of these things," Isabella said finally, swirling her wine thoughtfully, "and I've gotten pretty good at reading people. You know what I've noticed?" She turned to look at me, and there was something in her expression that was equal parts curious and sympathetic. "Chloe talks about everyone's spouse, Dr. Evans's husband and his vintage car collection that he restores on weekends, Dr. Garcia's wife and her art gallery in Soho, even Dr. Lee's partner and their charity work with homeless youth programs. She brags about their accomplishments, uses them as social currency, makes sure everyone knows how impressive her colleagues' families are." She paused, taking a sip of wine, and I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. "But she never mentions you," she continued, "never talks about your business, your achievements, your expertise. In fact, until I specifically asked her about you last month during a board meeting, I didn't even know what you did for a living. Why is that?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt something uncomfortable twist in my chest, because hearing someone else point out what I'd been trying not to acknowledge for months somehow made it more real. I laughed, but it came out bitter and a little broken. Because apparently being successful in logistics isn't sexy enough for her new corporate image. I don't have a gallery, or restore vintage cars, or run a charity. I just make sure things get from point A to point B without falling apart, and somehow that's not impressive enough to mention at cocktail parties. Isabella's expression shifted to something that looked like genuine anger on my behalf, which was weird because we barely knew each other. And yet here she was, more upset about my treatment than my own wife had been in months. "That's ridiculous," she said flatly. "Do you know how many companies would kill for someone with your expertise? Do you know how much money you could save an organization like ours? Your work is literally the difference between a successful drug launch and a multi-million-dollar disaster." "Try telling my wife that," I said, taking a long drink of wine. "Pretty sure she sees me as just another box to check on her perfect life checklist. Husband? Check. House in a good neighborhood? Check. Someone to bring to company events so she doesn't look weird showing up alone? Check and check."
Isabella was quiet for a moment, studying me with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. Then she smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you feel like maybe the universe wasn't completely garbage after all. "You know what I think?" she said. "I think competence is incredibly attractive. Intelligence is attractive. Someone who's genuinely good at what they do and doesn't need to brag about it, that's attractive. And anyone who can't see that is an idiot." Before I could process what was probably the nicest thing anyone had said to me in months, she reached into her small clutch and pulled out a business card, pressing it into my hand. Her fingers lingered there for just a second longer than strictly professional. And when she leaned in closer, I could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. "Call me if you ever want to work with someone who actually values your expertise," she said quietly. And there was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't just talking about business, though she was definitely talking about business too. "And if you ever want to have a conversation with a woman who appreciates what you bring to the table, well, I'm available for that too." Her hand was still on my shoulder, warm and solid and real. And we were standing there in this moment that felt like it belonged in a movie, the kind where the music swells and the city lights twinkle in the background and everything feels charged with possibility. I was very aware of how close she was, how her eyes were locked on mine, how this could very easily turn into something that would complicate my already complicated life in ways I hadn't even begun to consider. And that's exactly when I heard the sound of expensive heels clicking rapidly across the rooftop tiles, followed by a voice that could have frozen nitrogen. "Get your hands off my husband!" Chapter 5: The Meltdown That Broke LinkedIn. If you've never seen your wife's face transform from corporate professional to full-blown reality TV meltdown in approximately 0.3 seconds, let me tell you, it's quite the experience. Chloe's expression was this absolutely incredible mixture of pure rage, blind panic, and the kind of jealousy that could probably power a small city if you could figure out how to harness it. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the fact that she'd gone from "I'm a successful professional" to "I will burn this entire building down" faster than you could say hostile work environment.
"Get your hands off my husband," she screamed. And I'm not exaggerating when I say her voice echoed across that entire rooftop like she was auditioning for a Greek tragedy. The few other people who'd escaped to the terrace for some fresh air immediately whipped out their phones, because of course they did. This was prime social media content, the kind of corporate drama that would be dissected in break rooms and group chats for months to come. I could practically hear someone whisper, "This is better than The Office,"
from somewhere near the heat lamps. Isabella, to her absolute credit, didn't even flinch. She calmly removed her hand from my shoulder, took a measured sip of her wine, like this was just another Tuesday evening, and turned to face Chloe with the kind of composure that comes from years of dealing with difficult situations and people who were actively losing their minds. "Chloe," she said in a tone that was professional and maybe just slightly amused, "we were discussing business, supply chain optimization specifically. Perhaps you'd like to join the conversation." "Oh, sure," Chloe snapped, her voice dripping with so much sarcasm it could have stripped paint off the walls. "Discussing business, with your hand on his shoulder in the dark on a romantic rooftop. Do you think I'm stupid?" She was advancing on us now, her designer heels clicking against the stone tiles like a countdown to detonation. And I was genuinely concerned she might actually throw hands with her own boss, which would have been spectacular and career-ending in equal measure. "Technically," I said, because apparently my mouth had decided that now was the perfect time to demonstrate my inability to read a room, "this is considered a shoulder-to-shoulder mentoring situation. I'm pretty sure HR has a whole pamphlet about appropriate workplace physical contact, and shoulder touching is on page 3 under Generally Acceptable in Professional Contexts." Nobody laughed. Well, nobody except Liam the waiter, who I could see watching from the doorway with a tray of empty glasses and an expression of absolute delight. He gave me a subtle thumbs up that I appreciated even as I realized I'd probably just made everything exponentially worse. "This is unbelievable," Chloe hissed, and she'd moved past screaming into that deadly quiet anger that's somehow more terrifying. "You're hitting on my husband at a company event? You're my boss? This is sexual harassment. This is abuse of power. This is—" "Footage," Isabella interrupted calmly, gesturing to the security cameras mounted discreetly around the rooftop perimeter that I honestly hadn't even noticed until that exact moment. "There are 3 cameras with audio recording up here, Chloe. Feel free to report this to HR. The footage will show exactly what happened, which was a professional conversation about logistics that you've now turned into a scene that I guarantee at least 6 people are currently uploading to social media."
She wasn't wrong. I could see phone screens glowing in the darkness like fireflies, all pointed in our direction, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most documented professional meltdown in Innovate Pharma history. Someone was definitely going to make a TikTok out of this, probably multiple TikToks, maybe a whole series. But Chloe was past the point of rational thought. She'd gone full nuclear, and there was no bringing her back from the edge now. "You're a predator," she shouted, loud enough that I was pretty sure people in the ballroom below could hear her. "You're a predatory cougar who preys on married men. You're probably doing this to half the husbands here. This is disgusting. This is—" "That's enough," Isabella said, and her voice had gone from amused to ice-cold in an instant. The temperature on that rooftop dropped about 20 degrees, and even Chloe seemed to realize she'd just crossed a line that you didn't come back from. "You're a predator," she shouted, loud enough that I was pretty sure people in the ballroom below could hear her. "You're a predatory cougar who preys on married men. You're probably doing this to half the husbands here. This is disgusting. This is—" "That's enough," Isabella said, and her voice had gone from amused to ice-cold in an instant. The temperature on that rooftop dropped about 20 degrees. And even Chloe seemed to realize she'd just crossed a line that you didn't come back from. "You've just publicly accused me of sexual harassment and called me a predator in front of witnesses and cameras. You've created a hostile work environment, engaged in insubordination, and slandered a senior executive. I strongly suggest you stop talking immediately and consult with HR first thing Monday morning." The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring.
Even the city noise from below seemed to quiet down, like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Chloe's face had gone from angry red to terrified white as the implications of what she'd just done started to sink in through the fog of her jealous rage. I didn't mean, she started, but Isabella held up one hand. Save it for HR, she said coolly. Then she turned to me, and her expression softened just slightly. Daniel, it was lovely talking with you. I meant what I said about the consultation work. My offer stands. She handed me another business card, because apparently she carried multiple, and walked past Chloe toward the door like she was simply leaving a particularly boring meeting rather than the scene of a career-ending meltdown. As she passed Liam, I heard her say, "Make sure someone sends me the footage from tonight for documentation purposes." Liam nodded enthusiastically, looking like he'd just been given the best assignment of his entire serving career. And then it was just me and Chloe standing on that rooftop, with half a dozen people still recording on their phones, and the dawning realization on my wife's face that she'd just nuked her entire career from orbit over a conversation about supply chain logistics and some wine on a rooftop.
The phones were still out, still recording, capturing every moment of her breakdown for posterity and HR's investigative file. "Daniel," she said, her voice small and broken now, all the fight gone out of her. "Daniel, I didn't mean to." "Yeah," I said, pocketing Isabella's business card. "You never do." And I walked past her toward the door, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of her own making, probably already calculating how much this was going to cost her, and coming up with numbers that made her want to throw up. Behind me, I could hear her start to cry, but for the first time in years, I didn't turn back. The drive home felt like being trapped in a confession booth where the priest had left, God wasn't answering, and the only person there to witness your sins was your husband, who just watched you commit career suicide in high definition. Chloe was in the passenger seat of our Audi, phone pressed to her ear with the desperation of someone trying to bail water out of the Titanic with a teaspoon, calling literally everyone in her contact list who might possibly have the power to undo what had just happened. Spoiler alert, nobody had that power, because you can't unring a bell that's been recorded from 6 different angles and was probably already trending on Twitter. "Jessica, please, you have to listen to me," Chloe was saying into her phone, her voice doing that thing where it gets higher and tighter when panic really sets in. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just protecting my marriage. Isabella was being completely inappropriate with my husband, and I just—" She paused, listening, and I watched her face crumble in real time as whatever Jessica was saying on the other end clearly wasn't what she wanted to hear. "What do you mean it's already online? How is it already online? We left 15 minutes ago." I kept my eyes on the road, navigating through the downtown traffic that was somehow still heavy even at 11 at night, and tried to feel something other than this weird combination of satisfaction and exhaustion. Part of me wanted to gloat, wanted to point out that this was what happened when you treated people like disposable accessories and then freaked out the second someone showed them basic respect. But mostly, I just felt tired. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from maintaining a performance for so long that you forget what your actual face looks like without the mask. "Oh my God," Chloe breathed, and I glanced over to see her staring at her phone screen like it had just told her the world was ending, which for her career, it probably had. "Oh my God, Jennifer from accounting sent me the TikTok. Daniel, there's a TikTok. Someone made a TikTok of me screaming at Isabella, and it has—" She scrolled frantically, her fingers shaking. "It has 47,000 views already. 47! And the comments? Oh God, the comments are calling me psychotic and unhinged and—" "Maybe don't read the comments," I suggested mildly, taking a turn toward our neighborhood. "That's like rule number 1 of internet survival. Never read the comments." She ignored me, continuing to scroll with the kind of horrified fascination people have when watching footage of their own car accident. Someone made a remix, she whispered. They auto-tuned my voice and made a remix of me yelling, "Get your hands off my husband!" And it's actually kinda catchy. Oh my God, I'm a meme. I'm a corporate meltdown meme. By the time we pulled into our driveway in our nice suburban neighborhood with the HOA that definitely didn't allow for public scandals, Chloe had called approximately 17 people, ranging from her direct supervisor to her college roommate to someone I was pretty sure was her hairstylist. Each call had ended with some variation of, "Oh my God, it's already online," followed by the soul-crushing realization that, yes, it was very much already online, and no, there was no delete button for viral corporate meltdowns. She sat in the car for a moment after I turned off the engine, staring at her phone like it might spontaneously combust, which honestly would have probably been a mercy at this point. The glow from the screen lit up her face in the darkness, and I could see the exact moment another wave of panic hit when she presumably saw another notification or comment or share or whatever metric of public humiliation was currently climbing. "Daniel," she said finally, turning to me with eyes that were red from crying and probably from staring at a screen for 30 minutes straight. "Daniel, please, you have to help me. You have to talk to Isabella for me. Tell her it was all a misunderstanding. Tell her I was just emotional and I didn't mean any of it. Tell her what exactly?" I interrupted, and I was genuinely curious what spin she thought could possibly salvage this situation. Tell her that you didn't mean it when you called her a predatory cougar in front of half the company and multiple recording devices? Tell her you didn't mean it when you accused your boss of sexual harassment based on absolutely nothing? Which part didn't you mean, Chloe? I saw her touching you, and I saw the way she was looking at you, and She made this helpless gesture with her hands, like she was trying to physically grasp an explanation that made sense. "You're my husband, mine." And she was standing there acting like she had some right to you, like she could just have a professional conversation with me, treat me like I had valuable expertise, acknowledge that I exist and have thoughts worth listening to. Yeah, I can see how that would be threatening, considering you've spent the entire evening pretending I was just a mobile drink dispenser. She flinched like I'd slapped her. And maybe I should have felt bad about that, but I really, really didn't. "That's not fair," she said weakly. "I was networking. I was trying to make connections and maintain my professional image, and I was an inconvenience to that image," I said flatly. "I get it. The problem is, you got so wrapped up in maintaining your perfect corporate persona that you forgot I'm an actual person. And when someone else remembered that fact, you lost your mind and nuked your career on a rooftop in front of God and TikTok." We sat there in silence for a moment, and I could hear her phone buzzing continuously with what I assumed were notifications, messages, calls from people who'd seen the footage. The suburban night was quiet around us. All our neighbors probably asleep, or at least pretending to be unaware that the couple in the colonial with the nice lawn was currently sitting in their driveway having the kind of conversation that typically preceded major life changes. "Should I also explain to Isabella why you called your boss a cougar in 4K resolution?" I asked, because apparently I wasn't done yet. "Because I'm pretty sure that's the kind of thing that HR tends to frown upon. Actually, I'm not pretty sure. I'm absolutely certain, because I may just do something with logistics, but even I know that publicly slandering your superior is generally considered a career-limiting move." "This isn't funny, Daniel," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "You're absolutely right," I agreed, opening my car door. "It's not funny at all. It's hilarious. You finally noticed me tonight, Chloe. After months of treating me like I was invisible, you finally saw me. But the only reason you noticed is because your career is currently on fire, and you need me to be your emergency extinguisher. That's not really the heartwarming marriage moment you seem to think it is."
I got out of the car and headed toward our front door, leaving her sitting there in the passenger seat, phone still glowing in the darkness, probably refreshing her social media to watch the view count climb on her public humiliation. Behind me, I heard her car door open and her heels on the driveway, but I didn't turn around. Some fires you just had to let burn. 3 days after what was now being referred to on corporate Twitter as the #InnovateRooftop incident, complete with its own hashtag and several meme accounts, I got an email from Isabella Rossi's executive assistant requesting a meeting at Innovate Pharma headquarters. I stared at that email for a solid 10 minutes, reading and rereading it like the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense or was less terrifying. Trying to figure out if this was a good thing or if I was about to be dragged into the HR nightmare that Chloe had created like collateral damage in her personal disaster movie. Chloe, for her part, had spent the last 72 hours locked in our home office, alternating between crying, refreshing her social media feeds, and having increasingly desperate phone conversations with people who could, maybe, possibly, help her salvage what was left of her career.
There wasn't much left to salvage. The video of her meltdown had gone properly viral. The kind of viral where morning talk shows were using it as an example of workplace behavior to avoid, and business podcasts were doing entire episodes on managing emotional regulation in professional settings. Someone had even made a remix that was climbing the Spotify comedy charts, which was both impressive and deeply, deeply sad. I didn't tell her about Isabella's meeting request, partly because I genuinely didn't know what it was about and didn't want to give her false hope or send her into another spiral, and partly because I was still processing my own complicated feelings about the whole situation. Was I supposed to feel guilty that my wife's career had imploded? Was I supposed to feel vindicated that someone had finally seen value in me? Was I allowed to be excited about a potential business opportunity, even though it came from the woman my wife had publicly accused of being a predator? The emotional calculus was exhausting, and I was running low on the energy required to care about anyone's feelings except my own. So on Thursday morning, I put on my best suit, the charcoal gray one that made me look like I actually knew what I was doing, and drove downtown to the Innovate Pharma building, which was one of those modern glass towers that looked like it had been designed by someone who really believed in the power of natural light and expensive architecture. The lobby alone probably cost more than my entire house, all marble and steel and abstract art that I was pretty sure was supposed to mean something profound, but mostly just looked like someone had sneezed paint onto a canvas and called it genius. Isabella's assistant, a sharp-looking woman in her 30s named Eleanor, who had the kind of efficiency that suggested she could probably run a small country in her spare time, greeted me with a professional smile and escorted me up to the executive floor. The elevator ride felt like it took approximately 17 years, and I spent the entire time wondering if I should have rehearsed what I was going to say, or prepared some kind of statement, or maybe just faked my own death and moved to Canada. Isabella's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone at her level. Corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and that particular smell of success that's part expensive leather and part intimidation. She was sitting behind a mahogany desk that looked like it could double as a small aircraft carrier, typing something on her computer. And when I walked in, she looked up and smiled like I was an actual appointment she'd been looking forward to, rather than an obligation or a problem to be managed. "Daniel," she said warmly, standing up and coming around the desk to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming. I hope the request wasn't too sudden." She was dressed in a navy power suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, and she looked every inch the executive VP, but her smile was genuine and her handshake was firm without being aggressive. "Please, sit." I sat in one of the leather chairs across from her desk, trying to look casual and probably failing spectacularly, and waited for her to explain why I was here. Was this about the rooftop incident? Was I going to be asked to make some kind of statement? Was this actually a trap, and I was about to be served with papers for something I didn't even know I'd done? Isabella sat down across from me, not behind her desk, which would have been the power move, but in the other chair, so we were more or less on the same level, and she slid a folder across the small table between us. "I'm going to be direct because I think you appreciate directness," she said. "This is a proposal for a 3-year consulting contract with Innovate Pharma, full logistics overhaul of our distribution network, with your firm as the lead consultant. We're talking comprehensive supply chain optimization, cold chain integrity improvements, predictive routing implementation, the works." I opened the folder, my hands shaking slightly because this was not at all what I'd been expecting, and started reading through the terms. And then I saw the numbers, the actual dollar amounts, and I had to read them 3 times because surely there was a decimal point in the wrong place. Or maybe I'd suddenly developed dyslexia, or possibly I was having a stroke. "This can't be right," I said, looking up at her. "These numbers are accurate," she finished. "That's what your expertise is worth, Daniel. That's what solving our distribution problems is worth. We're currently losing somewhere between 8 and 12 million annually to inefficiencies, spoilage, and distribution failures. If you can cut that by even 50%, you'll have paid for yourself 3 times over in the first year alone." I sat back in my chair, trying to process what was happening. This was the kind of contract that would take my small firm and turn it into something significant, the kind of opportunity that most consultants spent their entire careers hoping to land. "I have to ask," I said carefully, "is this some kind of revenge deal? Like, you're offering me this because of what happened with Chloe? Because if that's what this is—" "This is business," Isabella interrupted firmly. "I don't make multi-million-dollar decisions based on personal drama, Daniel. I make them based on competence, expertise, and return on investment. I've done my research on your firm. I've talked to 3 of your former clients. I've reviewed case studies of your work. You're talented, you're innovative, and your success rate is impressive. The fact that your wife couldn't see that is her loss and potentially my company's gain." She leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. "I'll be honest with you. What happened on that rooftop was unfortunate, and Chloe is currently suspended pending a full HR investigation. But that has nothing to do with this offer. I was already planning to approach you about consulting work before that gala even happened. The rooftop conversation just confirmed what I'd already suspected, that you're intelligent, composed under pressure, and significantly undervalued in your current situation." "My current situation being my marriage?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your current professional network," she corrected smoothly. But there was a slight smile on her face that suggested she knew exactly what I'd meant. Though I suppose those things are sometimes connected. I looked down at the contract again, at the numbers that could change my entire business trajectory, at the scope of work that was both challenging and exciting, at the 3-year timeline that represented a significant commitment from both sides. This was real. This was legitimate. This was the kind of opportunity that I'd be an idiot to turn down, even if the circumstances around it were complicated as hell. "I'd need to have my lawyer review this," I said, which was the smart thing to say, even though every part of me wanted to sign it right there and then. "Of course," Isabella said. "Take your time. Have your lawyer review it, have your accountant review it. Hell, have your therapist review it if that would make you feel better. I want you to be completely comfortable with this arrangement." She stood up, and I followed suit, and we shook hands again. Her grip was confident. Her smile was professional but warm. And when she said, "I look forward to working with you, Daniel," I actually believed that she meant it. As I walked out of her office with the folder under my arm, feeling like I just stepped into an alternate universe where people actually valued my work, I passed Eleanor's desk, and she gave me a knowing smile. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "Mrs. Rossi doesn't usually spend that much time on consultation contracts unless she's really impressed." I made it to my car before I called my lawyer, my accountant, and then my business partner, Mark, who'd been running our firm with me since we'd started it 8 years ago. "Dude," I said when he picked up, "you're not going to believe what just happened." "Let me guess," Mark said dryly. "Your wife's meltdown video hit 10 million views." "Better," I said, pulling the contract out of the folder. "We just got offered the contract of a lifetime, and my accountant is probably going to faint when I tell him the numbers." There was a pause. Because of the meltdown, or in spite of it? Apparently in spite of it, I said, grinning at my steering wheel like an idiot. Turns out being good at what you do actually matters to some people. Huh, Mark said. Wild concept. So, when do we start? After my lawyer makes sure this isn't actually a very elaborate prank, I said. But assuming it's real? Soon. Very soon. I hung up and sat in my car in the Innovate Pharma parking garage, holding a contract that represented everything I'd been working toward for years, offered by a woman who'd seen my value in a single conversation, while my wife had spent years overlooking it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the opportunity. I started the car and headed home, where Chloe was probably still refreshing her social media feeds and trying to figure out how to explain temporary suspension pending investigation on her LinkedIn profile. I didn't know what I was going to tell her about this meeting or if I was going to tell her anything at all, but for the first time in years, I felt like maybe the story wasn't just about her anymore. Working with Isabella was like stepping through a portal into an alternate dimension where people actually listened when I talked and didn't treat my opinions like suggestions from a moderately intelligent golden retriever. Our first official meeting happened the following Monday in Innovate Pharma's main conference room, which had one of those huge tables that could probably seat the entire United Nations and a video screen that was larger than my first apartment. I showed up with my laptop, 3 different presentations I'd prepared over the weekend, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing this could either be the beginning of something incredible or a spectacular disaster that would haunt me for years. Isabella walked in exactly on time, because of course she did, followed by her distribution team leads, James from logistics, Patricia from quality assurance, and Marcus from IT, who was thankfully not the same Liam who'd been serving drinks at the gala, but who seemed equally competent and significantly more sober. They all looked at me with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism, which was fair because I was basically the new guy who'd been hired under somewhat dramatic circumstances that probably everyone in the building had heard about by now. "All right," Isabella said, settling into her chair at the head of the table and looking directly at me. "Daniel, show us what you've got. And everyone else, I expect you to actually listen and engage. He's here because he's good at what he does, not because of any other reason. And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me after this meeting." The room got very quiet very fast, and I realized she'd just preemptively shut down any gossip or speculation about why I was really there. It was a power move that both protected me and made it clear that this was business, period. End of discussion. I kinda loved her for it in a purely professional way that I definitely wasn't going to examine too closely right now. I launched into my presentation, outlining the problems I'd identified in their current distribution system just from the preliminary data they'd sent me. Temperature inconsistencies during transport, inefficient routing that added unnecessary time and cost, lack of real-time monitoring that meant problems weren't caught until it was too late, and a communication breakdown between warehouses and delivery teams that would have been funny if it wasn't costing them millions. The team started out polite but cautious, but about 15 minutes in, Patricia interrupted with a question about my proposed IoT sensor solution, and suddenly we were having an actual conversation instead of me just talking at people. James wanted to know about implementation timelines. Marcus got excited about the data analytics dashboard I'd mocked up. Patricia had concerns about FDA compliance, which were completely valid, and I had answers that satisfied her. Isabella just sat there watching the whole thing with this expression that I couldn't quite read, but that seemed pleased, taking notes occasionally and letting her team engage without micromanaging the conversation. By the time we wrapped up 2 hours later, we'd mapped out a preliminary implementation strategy, identified the highest priority problems to tackle first, and scheduled follow-up meetings with each department. James actually shook my hand and said, "This is good work, man, really good work." Patricia nodded approvingly and told me she looked forward to our next meeting. Even Marcus, who'd been the most skeptical at the start, admitted that my technical approach was solid. As everyone filed out, Isabella hung back,
And when the door closed behind the last person, she turned to me with a smile that was part professional pride and part something else I definitely wasn't going to think about right now. "That was impressive," she said simply. "You handled their questions perfectly, you addressed their concerns without being defensive, and you got buy-in from a team that typically resists any kind of change. Well done." "Thanks," I said, feeling genuinely good about myself for the first time in months. "Your team is sharp. They asked the right questions." "They did," she agreed, "because I hire smart people." Speaking of which, she moved a little closer, and I was suddenly very aware that we were alone in this conference room with its glass walls that anyone could see through but nobody could hear through. "How are you holding up with everything?" She didn't have to specify what everything meant. We both knew she was talking about Chloe, the suspension, the ongoing HR investigation, the viral videos that were still making rounds on social media. My home life had essentially become a disaster zone, where my wife oscillated between blaming me for not defending her and begging me to somehow fix things, neither of which I was particularly interested in doing. "I'm managing," I said honestly. "It's complicated. But this," I gestured at the conference room, the presentation materials, the whole situation. "This is good. This is really good. It reminds me that I'm actually good at something, which is a feeling I'd kind of forgotten about." Isabella's expression softened, and she reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, professionally, but with genuine warmth. "You're more than good at something, Daniel. You're excellent. And I don't just mean professionally, though that's certainly true." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I know this is a complicated situation. I know there are boundaries we need to maintain. But I want you to know that I see you. Not as Chloe's husband, not as a consolation prize or a revenge plot or whatever people might be saying. I see you as a talented professional who deserves to be valued, and as someone who's probably been underestimated for far too long." There was something in her voice that suggested she wasn't just talking about my professional life anymore, and I felt something shift in the air between us, something charged and complicated and potentially dangerous if we weren't careful.
But before either of us could say anything else, her phone buzzed with what was apparently an urgent message, and the moment passed. "I have a board meeting," she said with a slight grimace. "But same time next week, and Daniel—" She smiled as she gathered her things. "I don't mix business with pleasure as a general rule, but if I did, I'd make sure the pleasure part was just as efficient and well executed as the business part." She walked out, leaving me standing there in that conference room, wondering if she'd just flirted with me or given me a performance review, or possibly both. And realizing that for the first time in my marriage, I was actually thinking about what it would be like to be with someone who saw me as an equal rather than an accessory. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that led to complicated decisions and life changes and probably therapy. But damn if it didn't feel good to be seen. 6 months later, I found myself standing in the same Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom where my life had effectively imploded and rebuilt itself in the span of one chaotic evening. Except this time, I wasn't the invisible +1 hovering awkwardly by the bar, wondering if anyone would notice if I just left. This time, I was walking in as Isabella Rossi's business partner. And yeah, maybe something more than that, though we'd been incredibly careful about keeping the professional and personal aspects of our relationship separate enough that HR couldn't find anything to complain about, even if they wanted to. The transformation in 6 months had been nothing short of surreal. My firm had gone from a respectable but small operation to landing 3 major contracts off the back of the Innovate Pharma success story, which had already saved them over $12 million and was being used as a case study in supply chain optimization that industry publications were actually writing articles about. My team had grown from 15 people to 32. We'd moved into a bigger office that didn't smell like the previous tenant's questionable life choices, and I'd been invited to speak at 2 conferences about pharmaceutical logistics, which was apparently a thing people cared about when you were good at it.
Chloe, on the other hand, had been officially terminated from Innovate Pharma after the HR investigation concluded that she'd created a hostile work environment, engaged in insubordination, and publicly slandered a senior executive with absolutely no evidence to support her claims. The viral video hadn't helped her case, obviously, and neither had the fact that 3 other employees came forward during the investigation to report that she'd been increasingly difficult to work with over the past year. She'd eventually landed a position at some pharmaceutical research facility in Wisconsin, which she described to her mother as a strategic lateral move, but which everyone else understood to be a massive demotion to a place where her main colleagues were probably going to be cornfields and regret.
We were separated now, officially, with divorce papers that had been filed 2 months ago and were currently working their way through the legal system at the speed of bureaucracy, which is to say, glacially slow, but inevitably final. She'd moved out of our house and into an apartment near her new job, taking half the furniture and all of her wounded pride with her. The last conversation we'd had was about dividing up the wedding china, which she'd insisted she wanted, even though neither of us had used it in 5 years, and which I'd happily given her, because honestly, good riddance to both the plates and the marriage they represented. Tonight's gala was Innovate Pharma's annual event again, a full year after the rooftop incident that had launched 1,000 memes, and the energy in the room was completely different from my perspective. Isabella and I arrived together, which raised exactly 0 eyebrows, because everyone knew we'd been working closely together. And after 6 months of respectful distance and careful professionalism, we'd finally decided that we were both adults who could make our own decisions about our personal lives without requiring permission from the court of public opinion. She looked stunning in an emerald green dress that probably cost more than my first car, but was somehow understated enough to be elegant rather than showy. And when we walked in together, people actually greeted me by name. Not Chloe's husband or, that guy from the video, but Daniel Clark, the logistics consultant, or Daniel, great to see you again. It was a weird feeling, being recognized for my own accomplishments rather than as someone's accessory. And I was still getting used to it, in the same way you get used to sunlight after living in a cave for too long. Dr. Roberts spotted us almost immediately and came over with his wife, Sarah, who'd apparently become something of a friend over the past few months. "Daniel, Isabella, glad you both could make it," he said, shaking my hand enthusiastically. "I was just telling Sarah about how your routing optimizations saved our Midwest distribution network. We haven't lost a single temperature-sensitive shipment in 4 months. 4 months! That's unheard of!" That's what happens when you actually implement proper monitoring systems, instead of hoping for the best and praying to the logistics gods, I said with a grin, and Sarah laughed. "I have to say," Sarah added, glancing between Isabella and me with an expression that was knowing but kind, "you two make a much better team than some other combinations we've seen at these events." She didn't say Chloe's name, but she didn't have to. We all knew exactly what combination she was referring to. And the ghost of that disaster was still floating around this ballroom like an awkward specter that everyone was politely pretending not to notice. Isabella slipped her hand into mine, which was a gesture that was both professional enough to be appropriate and personal enough to make a statement, and smiled at Sarah. "I believe in partnering with people who actually bring value to the table," she said smoothly, "in business and in life." We made our rounds through the ballroom, and it was like watching a completely different movie of the same event. People wanted to talk to me now, not just as an obligatory courtesy, but because they were genuinely interested in what I had to say. James from Logistics pulled me aside to discuss expanding our contract to cover their European distribution network. Patricia from Quality Assurance introduced me to her counterpart from another pharmaceutical company who was interested in our services. Even the bartender, a different kid with better hair than the man-bun guy from last year, gave me a nod of recognition like I was a regular who deserved respect. Isabella had to give a speech at some point during the evening, talking about the company's achievements over the past year. And when she got to the part about operational improvements and cost savings, she actually called me out by name.
Our partnership with Daniel Clark's firm has resulted in unprecedented improvements to our distribution efficiency, she said, gesturing toward where I was standing near the back of the crowd, trying not to look too pleased with myself. His innovative approach and expertise have saved this company over $12 million in the past 6 months alone, and I'm proud to say we've just signed an extension of our contract for another 3 years. The room applauded, and I felt my face get hot because public recognition was still weird, even when it was positive. But Isabella was looking at me with this expression of genuine pride, and maybe something else, that made my chest feel tight in a way that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. When she finished her speech and made her way back to me through the crowd, she was intercepted approximately 17 times by people who wanted to congratulate her or network or discuss business opportunities. But she kept glancing over at me like she was making sure I was still there, still real, still part of this life she was building. When she finally reached me, she took my hand again and leaned in close enough that I could smell her perfume, something sophisticated that probably had a French name I couldn't pronounce. "Want to get some air?" she asked quietly, and there was something in her voice that made it clear she wasn't just talking about escaping the crowd for a breather. Last time we got air at one of these things, it ended in viral infamy and an HR investigation, I pointed out, but I was already moving toward the exit with her.
Yes, but this time you're here with someone who actually appreciates you, she said, and the smile she gave me was warm and real and a little bit dangerous in the best possible way. And I promise not to scream at anyone on the rooftop. We made it to the same rooftop terrace where everything had fallen apart a year ago. Except this time, the air felt different, lighter, like the universe had decided to give us a do-over on that entire evening. The city lights spread out below us like a promise, and Isabella turned to face me with an expression that was part professional pride and part something that had nothing to do with business contracts or logistics optimization. "You know what I realized?" she said, reaching up to loosen my tie slightly, her fingers lingering at my collar in a way that was definitely not HR approved. "A year ago, I watched a talented man being treated like he was invisible by someone who should have been proud to stand next to him, and I thought, what a waste. What an absolute waste of potential." "And now?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "Now I get to watch that same man walk into a room and command respect because he earned it," she said softly. "Now I get to work with someone who challenges me intellectually and doesn't see me as a threat or a prize, but as an equal. Now I get to stand next to someone who makes me want to be better at everything I do. That's not a waste, Daniel. That's exactly what I was hoping for." She kissed me then, right there on the rooftop where everything had imploded a year ago. And it felt like closing one chapter and opening another, like the universe was writing a better story, and we were finally getting the good parts. Somewhere below us, the gala continued. People networked and made deals and pretended to care about things they didn't really care about. But up here in the cool night air with the city lights spread out like stars, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. When someone asked me later that evening if I missed my old life, I said, not even a little bit. Turns out, being respected is incredibly addicting, and I'm not interested in going back to being anyone's accessory ever again. Exactly 1 year after the chaos, Isabella and I returned to the Grand Meridian Ballroom for what had become Innovate Pharma's biggest annual event yet. And this time, we weren't just attending as business partners who happened to be dating. We were there celebrating the announcement of a new joint venture between Innovate Pharma and my firm. A partnership that was being hailed as innovative and forward-thinking, and all those other buzzwords that corporate people love to throw around when something is actually working. The contract was worth enough money that my accountant had actually called me 3 times to make sure I hadn't accidentally added extra zeros. And when I assured him the numbers were correct, he'd gone silent for a solid 30 seconds before saying, "Holy shit," in a tone of reverent disbelief.
The ballroom was packed with industry leaders, investors, journalists from pharmaceutical trade publications, and basically everyone who was anyone in the world of drug manufacturing and distribution. There was a photo shoot scheduled, interviews lined up, and a whole media package that Isabella's PR team had coordinated with the precision of a military operation. I was wearing a custom suit that actually fit properly. Isabella was in a stunning black dress that somehow managed to be both professional and devastating, and we were both running on adrenaline and expensive coffee. Isabella raised her champagne glass during the toast, standing at the front of the room with the kind of confidence that came from knowing you'd made all the right moves and won the game. "To valuable partnerships," she said, her eyes finding mine in the crowd. And there was a warmth in her gaze that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the fact that we'd built something real together, both professionally and personally. To recognizing potential before the rest of the world catches on. "To women who notice talent when they see it," I added, raising my own glass, and to men who were smart enough to take the opportunities they were offered, even when those opportunities came wrapped in complicated circumstances and viral videos. The room laughed, because by now the rooftop incident had become something of a legend in pharmaceutical industry circles, the kind of story people told at conferences about how drama and opportunities sometimes showed up at the same time. Someone had even made a case study out of it for a business school class about crisis management and professional pivots, which was both hilarious and slightly horrifying. We posed for photos together, Isabella's hand resting comfortably on my back, my arm around her waist, both of us smiling like people who'd figured out how to build something good from the wreckage of something that had been slowly dying for years. The photographers loved us apparently, because we had chemistry and authenticity and looked like a pharmaceutical power couple from a movie about corporate success stories with romantic subplots. As we stood there with camera flashes going off like small supernovas, I found myself thinking about that night a year ago when I'd stood in this same ballroom feeling invisible and wondering when my marriage had turned into a performance piece where I played the role of human furniture. I thought about Chloe's face when she'd seen Isabella talking to me on the rooftop, that mixture of jealousy and panic and rage that had burned her entire career to the ground in about 30 seconds. I thought about the car ride home, her desperate phone calls, the way she looked at me like I was supposed to fix everything she'd broken. And then I thought about her face now, wherever she was in Wisconsin, probably scrolling through social media and seeing these photos, reading these press releases, watching me succeed in ways she'd never thought I could. I wondered if she felt regret, if she understood what she'd lost, if she'd finally figured out that treating people like accessories eventually meant they stopped wanting to be part of your collection. My phone buzzed in my pocket during a brief break between photo sessions, and I pulled it out to see a text message from a number I hadn't heard from in months, but still had saved in my contacts. Chloe. Of course, it was Chloe. The universe had a sense of dramatic timing that would have been impressive if it wasn't so predictable. The message said, "I saw the announcement. Congratulations. I hope you're happy." I stared at that text for a long moment, reading the words and trying to figure out if there was genuine well-wishing in them, or if this was just another attempt to insert herself into my life, to remind me that she existed, to maybe open a door that I'd firmly closed and locked and possibly set on fire for good measure. Isabella noticed me looking at my phone and raised an eyebrow in question, and I showed her the screen. She read it, her expression neutral, and then looked at me with those sharp eyes that never missed anything. "Are you going to respond?" she asked, and there was no judgment in her voice, just genuine curiosity about what I was going to do. I thought about it for maybe 3 seconds, which was probably 2 seconds longer than the message deserved. Then I deleted it without responding, slipped my phone back into my pocket, and took Isabella's hand. "No," I said, simply. "I don't think I am." Because happiness doesn't need validation, especially not from someone who'd spent years making me feel like I needed to apologize for existing in her carefully curated life. Happiness doesn't require explanations or justifications or responses to text messages from people who only noticed your value after they'd thrown it away. Happiness just is. And right now, standing in this ballroom with a woman who saw me as a partner rather than a prop, celebrating success that I'd earned through my own expertise and hard work, I was genuinely, authentically happy in a way I hadn't been in years. Isabella squeezed my hand, understanding everything I wasn't saying, and smiled at me with that mixture of warmth and mischief that I'd come to associate with her. "Good choice," she said. "Now come on, we have 3 more interviews and a dinner with investors, and I need you charming and articulate, not distracted by ghosts of relationships past."
"I can do charming and articulate," I said, grinning at her. "That's literally what you pay me for, among other things." "Among other things," she said with a smile that was definitely not appropriate for a professional setting. And I laughed, because life had gotten weird and complicated and surprisingly wonderful in the span of a year. As we walked back toward the cameras and the journalists and the celebration of everything we'd built together, I didn't look back toward my phone or think about that unanswered message or wonder what Chloe was feeling right now. Because Isabella was right about one thing. Being valued hits different when it's genuine. When it comes from someone who sees you as an equal rather than an accessory. When it's built on respect and partnership rather than obligation and convenience. And I was done settling for anything less.